Says going live. All right, we are live. Joining me today, a very special guest, David Papineau. David, for those who don't know you, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
Okay, I'm a philosopher. I'm a professional philosopher. I taught for a long time at King's College London. Last 5 or so years, I've been spending each spring semester at the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. So I work in philosophy of mind, but also in philosophy of science and metaphysics. My course this year at CUNY is on causation, interventionism. I used to do epistemology, but I kind of moved away from it, or maybe epistemology's moved away from me, and I don't advertise myself as an epistemologist anymore, but I used to do that. That's how I started. I thought of myself. Anyway, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, philosophy of science.
Well, I didn't know that about the dark past that you had in epistemology.
Well, it wasn't really epistemology as people now think of epistemology. It was to do with, I started as a philosopher of science, and it was methodology and to do with what methods should we use, how should we think to get at the truth. And I thought of epistemology as a practical discipline. And I mean, back then there were people who did intuitions about analyzing knowledge, and then that kind of went away, and now it's come back, if you ask me, with a vengeance. And I mean, I just wrote a paper, I don't know if you saw it, about the disvalue of knowledge. I finally found a good way of arguing that the notion of knowledge is not a good notion. I mean, it's very central in everyday thinking, and I think that's a bad aspect of everyday thinking. And I look at all my young colleagues who are exploring all these intuitions about knowledge and norms of assertion, norms of action, and so on. And I found a way of arguing that's all a pity. It's a pity we have all those intuitions.
I haven't read that paper, but I saw it on your website actually. Can you? I mean, I'm going to have an epistemologist on here eventually. I talked to Clayton Littlejohn, who I think you know, but I'm going to.
But Clayton's my colleague in London, and it's because of Clayton that I wrote this paper. He's very big in this knowledge first business, and one of the issues they have is statistical evidence in the law. Look, should we go on about this? I mean, this is not people have tuned in for consciousness.
We're gonna get to it. We got time.
So, and why can't you convict somebody just on the basis that it's highly likely? I mean, they're one of 100 people, 99 of whom are guilty, and you know that, and that's all you know. Why can't you convict them? And intuitively you can't. And there's a lot of literature in philosophy of law about what's behind this kind of prohibition on acting on naked statistical evidence. And my colleague Clayton, I think, has put his finger on it. He said, the thing is that we feel that we can't convict somebody unless we know they are guilty, and there's no way we can know that we haven't won the lottery. There's no way we can know that we haven't got the one innocent person. And he thinks that's what's driving our intuitions, even though we're perfectly happy to convict on the basis of eyewitness testimony, when there's only a kind of, there's a 1 in 5 chance the person isn't guilty, but there at least there's an 80% chance that we know. Whereas in the lottery case, the naked statistical evidence, there's a 100% chance that we don't know. We for sure don't know, and so we shouldn't convict. And I look at that and I think, but hang on. I mean, that might be how we intuitively think. That might be what we intuitively do, but it's a really bad idea. You're going to be convicting a lot of innocent people, and there's no reason to favor the eyewitness over the statistical evidence. And all that's jerking us around is the concept of knowledge, which involves kind of causal contact with the fact known. Anyway, so that was Clayton's idea. And I say, Clayton, you're right about our intuitions. And it highlights how the notion of knowledge is screwing us up.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm going to have to read that paper before. I've generally tried to avoid epistemology my whole life, actually.
Good. Well, look, we shouldn't be doing this. I mean,
okay, but your work has always been very influential on me. I've always admired your writing and the way you approach this stuff, especially your book, Thinking About Consciousness, which I think is a classic in this field. And in fact, I'm having my students currently on my class on science of consciousness reading the appendix on the case for materialism. So my thought was to basically to start there. I think this is something you still endorse. Is that correct? This the kind of causal closure argument for physicalism?
Yes, yes. I mean, I've got a bit uneasy about the way it's standardly posed because they're using causation that I'm quite sympathetic to, which suggests that often some event like a bit of bodily behavior. No, shall we do the? Shall I just? Do you want me to describe the causal closure argument first before I?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can assume some familiarity, but
my current misgivings. So the real gist of the causal closure argument is that the world as described by science doesn't seem to need to explain things at the most basic level in terms of anything except fundamental force fields that don't include any special force fields that are present in living bodies or conscious bodies or sentient bodies or anything like that. So the idea is that physics is complete unto itself. What happens in the physical realm is determined by all these very simple influences that don't include any sui generis mental influences. And if you accept that, and then you want to say, but look, what happens in my mind does make a difference in the physical world. After all, it leads me to act in certain ways. I influence the physical world. You want to assume that some physical changes have mental conscious causes. Well, if you think that, well, you better, as it were, push the mind down into the physical world. The only way the mind can make a difference in the physical world is by itself being physical. And that line of thought I still find pretty compelling, as indeed does pretty much everybody in this line of business. And I mean, we'll probably be talking about, I don't know, epiphenomenalists and panpsychists and Russellian monists and all kinds of people. And they all more or less respect the causal closure of the physical. They have all these strange views because they feel they can't have anything making a difference to what happens in the physical realm at the most basic level, except limited number of physical forces. You were talking about the history of this. I have a view about the history of this, which is that this is a very modern thing. We don't realize how modern it is. I think if we went back 100 years, informed scientific opinion wouldn't have found that argument compelling at all, because they would have thought that there are plenty of sui generis vital forces, mental forces, alongside gravitational forces, chemical forces, and so on. And they make an independent difference to what goes on in the physical realm. They wouldn't have had any difficulty. I mean, they were kind of Cartesian interactionists. And it's kind of modern microscience that I think has persuaded people out of that. We now think everything is made of atoms and subatomic particles, and a lot of us are kind of brought up with this picture of how reality is constituted. And then you don't have any room for these extra vital mental forces. But I look back at the history of this, and the kind of argument I gave, you see appearing very frequently in the middle of the last century. Feigl, Putnam and Oppenheim, David Lewis, Armstrong, Jack Smart, Donald Davidson, all thinking at the bottom level, everything is run by these basic physical forces. And so if we're not going to make the mind epiphenomenal, we better think of the mind as constituted in the same way. And I think the history is very interesting. I have a very crude view. I think that once you have a generation of philosophers who were taught atomic chemistry at school, then you're going to have this kind of physicalism. And I think atomic chemistry being taught at school was a pretty late thing. I mean, I don't know when we could go and look, but I suspect not until after the First World War, the 30s. And perhaps the earliest person who starts worrying about this kind of hegemony of microphysical reality is Bertrand Russell, in the Analysis of Matter circa 1930. Right. And he peculiarly was somebody who was making his living writing popular science. So he really got into modern microphysics much earlier than the average run of philosophers. And so he was writing the ABC of relativity, the ABC of atoms, the ABC of atoms.
Yeah. And this is an important point. It's also, we want to distinguish it from the kind of, excuse me, interaction problem that comes from Descartes. It's not the same as the mind-body problem is traditionally construed. Would you say that's correct?
So, I mean, Descartes did have a version of this problem. As Leibniz pointed out to Descartes, look, your physics, which is all in terms of impact and the conservation of motion. I mean, Leibniz had a slightly funny story. Leibniz's thought was basic 17th century atomic physics leaves no room for the mind to affect the physical realm without violating the basic laws of physics. And that was Leibniz's view. Leibniz thought that Descartes had a slightly wonky version of basic impact physics, which somehow left a little bit of wiggle room for the mind to make a difference. But so Leibniz said if Descartes had the right physics, he would have had just the problem for interactionism that I was describing. But it's a different problem from the standard one. Look, here's the mental realm, here's the physical realm. They're so very different. How can they possibly influence each other? If you have any kind of lightweight Humean constant conjunction view of causation, there's no reason why two different things shouldn't influence each other. Right. And indeed, I think scientific orthodoxy through the 18th, 19th, early 20th century was de facto a kind of interactionism. It had vital forces, nervous forces, forces of sensibility and irritability, all kinds of peculiarly forces associated with mental entities, and they were taken to be able to influence the motion of matter via force fields. And
this was nervous energy. That's where that comes from.
Exactly. Nervous energy, the potential energy of the nervous force field.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the 19th century idea was the nervous force field was a special kind of force field that was associated with sentient conscious beings, and when you were deliberating, you built up the potential energy of the nervous force field, and you were full of nervous energy, and then when the time for action came, you released it into kinetic energy. It's neat. I mean, it's really beautiful.
And in a way, it's
she's full of nervous energy. She's full of nervous energy. Exactly, that's what we say.
Exactly. And in a way, it's Newton's fault, right? Not his fault, but you can trace it back to the success of Newtonian mechanics, because the equations work, but they don't specify a mechanism. And so, spooky action at a distance isn't so spooky after you see it work a bunch of times and you don't understand how it's working.
But I don't think that's a bad bit about Newton. I mean, it's true that modern physics doesn't allow action at a distance. That's going to violate the conservation of energy in various ways, but it's still pretty spooky, a lot of the Newtonian force fields. I mean, they are all operating by contact between atoms bumping into each other. And so a nervous force field wouldn't be any worse than electromagnetic field in that respect. It's pretty, all force fields are pretty ethereal, and so would the nervous energy field. I mean, no, it's what's bad about it is, I mean, there's nothing kind of, as it were, from the point of view of basic physics bad. It's just that we don't think that there are special force fields that are present only in minded beings. I mean, that's the odd idea, that there's a special force field that, I mean, in the 19th century, these were regarded as perfectly regular force fields. I mean, Newtonian physics doesn't list what are the basic forces. Electricity, magnetism, gravity, and well, I didn't know about nuclear forces, but they had a list of forces of cohesion, chemical forces, forces of affinity, and then forces of irritability, sensibility, vital forces. I mean, they didn't especially think that some were more spooky than others. They were all just in the same line of business.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, so you're arguing for the idea that the causal closure argument would only be available or convincingly available to someone post-atomic physics, post the kind of microphysics that comes to in the 19th century, right? Is that, and that's an empirical.
Well, there's two aspects to the microphysics. One is that I think the evidence against special force fields comes from physiology, kind of intracellular physiology, intercellular physiology. I mean, Huxley and Hodgkin, the operation of nerve cells explained entirely in electrical chemical ways. Once you get that, you feel, well, at that level, we don't seem to need any of these fancy force fields. But there's something more general going on in our philosophical tradition, which is microscopic physics as a whole, i.e. a reality beyond the level of what's observable. I don't think we realize how modern that is philosophically. I mean, we know that idea was there in Descartes in the 17th century, but through the 18th and 19th century, that idea went away. Physics was all to do with charting the behavior of observable objects, and via empiricism, Kant, idealism, I mean, the whole tradition was against the idea that you could get at the reality behind the appearances.
Right.
And that was very built into the I'm just trying to get 18th, 19th century scientific ideology. Newton, hypothesis not fingo, we chart the appearances, that was the good idea. Descartes, strangely, was associated with the bad old ancient regime. Look at those ridiculous vortex theories and so on. That's all, you don't want to go in for that kind of thing. To the extent that in the 19th century, certainly in France and Germany, the dominant scientific view was that atomic theory shouldn't be taken seriously. That's not what we do in science. We don't make up these fairy stories. We're really interested in explaining the motion of observable bodies and various things like that. We're not interested in making up stories about microscopic particles. And the philosophers really had that as their worldview. So we might talk later about Russellian monism, sometimes interchangeably used with the term neutral monism. But our modern view, which is kind of fully committed to the reality of microphysics, was no part of the original neutral monism. Neutral monism was Marx's term, and for those people, they took it as obvious that reality was constituted out of the kind of thing that was given to you in experience. There were the givens of experience. These were the basic building blocks of reality. That was the standard scientifically informed Marxian view circa 1900. And the neutrality was, well, were these things mental or physical? Well, you could kind of group together a whole lot of these kind of given-like things in terms of, did they all appear to you from a certain perspective? Then you were thinking of them as mental things. You could group them together as, Berkeley-like, the appearances that make up a table. And then you were thinking of them as physical things. And these things, the givens, they were neutral. They were neutral between the mental and the physical. And you get it in the logical positivist Vienna circle debate about, right, was the basic language a physical language or the mental language? And you think people in favor of the physical language were physicalists, but they weren't physicalists like we think of physicalists. They weren't people who thought basic materials of reality were atoms and that. They thought the basic materials of reality were tabletops and things like that, as opposed to experiences of tabletops. That was the debate. Anyway, so I think you've got to get beyond that to be any kind of physicalist like we now are. You've got to take seriously the idea that there's a reality of micromechanisms behind the appearances, which many of us grew up with, but our equivalents in philosophy 100 years ago, that would have been a very strange view.
Yeah, I mean, I find the history here so fascinating. So I wonder what you think about like people like Democritus and early Greek atomism, who had a priori reasons for positing unseen elements. So I understand your view about the modern scientific approach and the way microphysicalism came to dominate, but it certainly wasn't a new idea that there was a hidden aspect to reality.
No, sure. I mean, so the phase of history I know reasonably well because I used to teach this. Before I was at King's College London, I was in Cambridge in the Department of History of Philosophy of Science, and one of my jobs for 10 years was to teach the history of the philosophy of science. So I read a lot of Descartes and Locke and Newton and Hume and Kant and so on. So and 19th century people thinking about atomic theory. So I know that period very well, and it's a kind of peculiarity. So I don't know very much about pre-modern, but certainly there were serious atomists then, and there were certainly serious atomists in the 17th century. But the idea of Newton and Locke, we can't seriously get behind the appearances. They both thought there were things behind the appearances, we couldn't get at them. But then the whole Berkeley, Hume, Kant, neo-Kantian tradition, by then it's a peculiarity of the last 2 centuries of our philosophical tradition. Idealism became completely dominant, or if not idealism, the idea that reality was composed of what was observable. And I tell my students, look, you don't realize everybody until about 1950 in our tradition was an idealist. You're not following, right? So Kant was an idealist. Mill was an idealist, right? Russell was an idealist. A.J. Ayer was an idealist.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just about old enough to remember this. I came in and people used to still be dealing with that.
Yeah, I found that very surprising when you first hear about the logical positivism, you're like, hardcore empiricism, yes, love it. Wait a minute, idealism? Uh-oh, what happened here?
Maybe we shouldn't be talking about this, but I want to do one more thing, because this really brings it home. Is Hempel, serious logical empiricist, late logical empiricist, kind of founding father of recent American philosophy of science. I grew up with Hempel's theoretician's dilemma. And it goes like the theoretician's dilemma. We have these theories in science, right? He's worrying about theories about unobservables, atoms and viruses and radio waves and stuff. We've got all these theories, right? And he says, what are these theories good for? If you're keen on theories, you've got a dilemma, because either the theories are charting what's true at the observable level, in which case we don't need them because we could just describe it all at observable level, or they're making false claims about what's going on at the observable level, in which case they're not a good idea at all. So either way, we'd be better off without theories. What are the theories good for, right? And when I first started doing philosophy, we were invited in philosophy of science to cut our teeth on this problem, and we came up with all these answers. It was kind of heuristically useful to have theories, because then they generated new observational predictions, or it was convenient to have theories because you couldn't remember all that observational stuff without kind of deriving it from this story about atoms. And we tried various, maybe they were kind of inductive predictions that you would be led to via the theories you couldn't get out of the observations. And I can remember reading in 1964, Putnam, What Theories Are Not.
Right.
And he says, so you're wondering why we have terms like electron and virus and radio wave? I'll tell you why. It's so we can talk about electrons and viruses and radio waves. And I looked at that and I kind of, it's one of those things you were kind of ready for it. And my mouth dropped open and I thought, yes, why was I writing all those essays? Easy answer here. But the truth is that for Hempel, and if you go and look at Nagel, the structure of science, I mean, for those people, it was kind of deep, unwritten, but complete commitment that the business of science was to describe what was observable, because that's what reality was. And then there was this other business making up stories about making up stories,
Right.
And that was how they thought of it. They didn't take seriously the idea that there really could be electrons and radio waves as part of reality. They came out of a tradition for which that wasn't available.
So do you think, I mean, this is kind of a tangent, but do you think scientific realism is part of the story about why physicalism came to be prominent? I mean, it sounds like sort of what you're saying in the background is before scientific realism was a serious contender, physicalism wasn't either.
Right, but in a way, what I'm saying is for that tradition, scientific realism wasn't even an option.
Right.
I mean, they didn't yet think that all this stuff about atoms and viruses and so on was a possible candidate account of what was real in reality. I mean, don't ask why they were. I mean, they could have been serious concept empiricists. We can't seriously think about things that we haven't observed. I mean, that was part of what was in the background. So, I mean, they thought theoretical talk was meaningless.
Right.
But there was a kind of prior commitment that reality was just made of what was observable. I mean, that was the deeper.
Yeah.
So if you look at Nagel, done in a chapter 4, Structure of Science, it's about realism versus instrumentalism, about theories, and he agonizes and faffs around, and his conclusion is that this isn't a substantial dispute.
Right.
He thinks that really these people are arguing about what's the best way to tell a story relative to what we all agree is the serious stuff, which is getting observable stuff right. So he wasn't even prepared to think there was an issue of scientific realism. But once you think there's an issue, then there's a debate about whether it's true. You get latter day anti-scientific realists like Van Fraassen. But I mean, Van Fraassen's an epistemological anti-realist. He thinks it makes perfect sense that there should be atoms and so on, but we just have no evidence for believing it. Those older guys thought it didn't really even make sense. That's
right. Yeah, that's so interesting. So I'm wondering what we're going to say about someone like Hobbes, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, so the brain is perfectly observable, a macroscopically respectable organ. People like Hobbes, they say consciousness is simply motions in the brain. So they don't need microphysical science.
Hobbes was a microphysicalist. He was the 17th century scientific.
He did endorse that.
Atomic theory. No. So here's the weirdest thing about our tradition, right? So Descartes and Hobbes and all the guys back then were full-on microphysical realists. I mean, they were absolutely committed to the mechanical view of the world. The world's like a clockwork. It's got all these bits. We can't see them, but we'll figure out one day what they are. So they were perfectly fine. Then what happened in the 17th century? Nobody got very good at figuring out what was behind the appearances.
Right.
I mean, they didn't really come up with any good microphysical theories. I mean, even simple things like what's the cause of air pressure? They knew there's air pressure, that was observable, but was it kind of little particles like we think? Was it the air was made of springs? Was it some kind of squishy elastic medium? They had no way of figuring it out. And Newton and Locke decided that you shouldn't, in science, go in for that kind of speculation. You could speculate, but it wasn't really a serious part of science. So they were kind of epistemological, maybe Van Fraassen-like anti-realists. It's not, I mean, it might be a fact of the matter, but it's beyond our ken. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had the kind of idealist turn. You deal with the skepticism that's implied by the Newton-Locke view by eliminating the reality of this supposed stuff behind the appearances. So as I said, I mean, Hobbes strikes me, and Descartes and Leibniz, I mean, all the Boyle, all the 17th century mechanists as just like modern people in this respect. It's the funny 2 centuries in between, 2.5 centuries in between that I think is so curious, and in a way many people have lost contact with how people thought back then.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what's good about this sorts of conversations, is reminding us about that. So, I mean, personally, I find the causal closure of the physical argument for physicalism very convincing. That's what sort of convinced me to be a physicalist to the extent I am. I don't think I have myself as like a real physicalist. I think of myself as someone who thinks physicalism is a live option and hasn't been refuted. So I don't know if I actually believe it's true or not, but I certainly think that it's one of the more plausible accounts. But
so what's the option? I mean, are you thinking specifically in relation to consciousness? Is that where you?
In relation to the mind.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I thought we were going to be talking about zombie arguments and Mary and so on.
We're getting there. Yeah, we're getting there. But I think this case for physicalism is important because it sets the base for all of those other discussions.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you would say, because sometimes people say that this whole causal closure argument depends on what engineers call being a closed system. And we don't have evidence that the universe is a closed system in that sense. So I wonder what you think about, I mean, so I get that this is an empirical, inductive kind of argument that we're making for the causal closure here. But it's not, I mean, we don't know it, do we? We're not, it could be false.
Sure, it's an empirical claim. I mean, I don't know where one would want to get off the bus. I mean, are we thinking specifically of making room for a non-physical mind to influence the physical world? We're thinking in terms, well, yeah. Where should
or
we?
Any kind of non-physical interaction.
Okay, as I said to you a while ago, I mean, that's an option. That's a serious option. But it's quite striking that few contemporary philosophers of mind, few informed philosophers of consciousness or philosophers of mind generally, are very interested in taking it. I mean, not many people do it. And how would you argue it? I mean, look, there's the Popper-Eccles view that there is a nervous force, and in the mind it's doing its thing here and there, and it's very hard to observe. And in fact, it's, if you take that view seriously, you might be disinclined to take the kind of neurophysiological evidence as conclusive against it. And it's very difficult to kind of prove, you know, there's no processes in the mind that can't be explained in terms of electrical chemical processes. That's a very hard thing to establish conclusively to somebody who believes the opposite. I'm not sure saying that all we ever study are closed systems and the real world isn't a closed system is really going to help you with that argument. I mean, sure, in the laboratory we try and engineer a closed system and see what goes on, and you might think that findings you get for closed manageable systems laboratory can't be extrapolated to the real world. That's kind of Nancy Cartwright's line of argument. Yeah. Often. Real world's much more messy. Don't suppose that fundamental physics governs things in the real world. I don't find that very convincing. Sure, so sometimes we start with a closed system and then we study it, and that all seems to work nice and simply physical. And then we worry about, is that an artifact of our just being so restrictive in what we allow to influence our system? So we look at a slightly more complicated system and we get the same answer. And somebody might say, still, but all the systems you study are, from a certain perspective, fairly limited and closed. And how can you extrapolate to systems beyond that? And my response is, why do you think that being simple enough to be studied by human beings is an inductively relevant property of things. Why do you think things are suddenly going to start behaving differently when they're beyond our ability to study? I mean, I think we've got a pretty reasonable sample.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm not saying I agree with this line of argument. I'm just wondering, you know, pressing.
So that closed systems argument, I don't find that convincing. I would, if I was inclined to be an interactive dualist, I'd just go straight for the line that that's a story that makes best sense of the manifest non-physicality of consciousness. I mean, that's something that moves many people,
right?
And the ability of the mind to influence the world. That there are special causal influences operating in minded beings that it's very hard for science to see. I mean, that seems to me a coherent position.
Right.
So as I say, it is, for what it's worth, I mean, I especially want to argue from authority, it's striking that, can you name any contemporary philosophers who take that line? I mean, I think...
who take that the physical's not closed? I don't know, there's Plantinga maybe?
I was about to mention Plantinga, I was about to mention E.J. Lowe.
E.J. Lowe, right. Those are about the only two I know. But they've influenced a lot of people. So those two people have a lot of followers, and I think that view is kind of common currency among them.
Well, maybe, but I had an email exchange with Plantinga at one point about this, and he was wondering whether quantum indeterminism left room for this independent mind to make a difference. And I tried to persuade him that no, it didn't. I mean, I think it's pretty clear it doesn't.
Right.
You know, quantum mechanics says that the chances of everything that happens are fixed by prior physical circumstances, and then what happens is random. I mean, that's what quantum mechanics says. And if you think that what happens isn't random relative to the price of physical circumstances, then you're contradicting quantum physics.
Well, I'm not sure that's clear. I mean, if I was going to be a dualist, I'd be a quantum dualist, to be honest. But certainly there doesn't seem to be a contradiction of quantum mechanics there if what you think is like some kind of non-physical consciousness causes the collapse of the wave function. And from our point of view, it appears to be random, but really it's, you know, determined by the mind of the person or something.
Two thoughts there.
Okay.
One is that it causes the collapse of the wave function. The other is that it does it in a non-random way.
Right.
The first idea is, well, it doesn't grab me at all, but it's got reasonably respectable antecedents in the philosophy of physics. And if you believe in collapses of the wave function, which many people do,
right.
It's a bit mysterious what causes them, and maybe interaction with a conscious mind is a reasonable thing. But note that still leaves the point I was making against Plantinga, that when the wave function collapses, maybe determined to do so by influence of the mind or some kind of special circumstance, what then happens is random, and that's built into quantum mechanics. That once you fix the basic physical fields, then whether the radium atom decays or not, or whether that molecule in your brain divides, is a random event. And if you think that
it appears random,
there's something extra, this nervous force field that's influencing whether the molecule divides, cogent position, but you're denying quantum mechanics in its saying that the basic physical fields fix the chances of its dividing. And you're saying now there's something else makes a difference to the chance of its dividing. That's contradicting quantum mechanics just as much as we've been assuming all along that right. Cartesian style interactive dualism would contradict basic physics, plus the assumption that there's no mental force fields.
Right. But it's just a little bit though. It's the view, as I understand it, I mean, there's different ways of developing, but one way of developing it would be that the probabilities are fixed by the physical,
Right.
unfolding of the wave function, but
Yeah.
which outcome actually, so if it's 50% up and 50% down, which one actually we observe might depend on the interaction with the mind. And
Well,
you could say, well, that's it randomly collapses, or you could say there's something about the non-physical interaction which non-randomly determines which way it goes.
Let's look at it like this. So here's what I'm saying is stated by quantum mechanics, that here's this molecule, there's a 50% chance of it staying together and a 50% chance of its dividing, and those chances are fixed by the prior physical circumstances, and that's it. It's just random. Okay. Now you say, in addition, let's suppose that consciously I decide to lift my arm, and that's going to make a difference to whether the molecule divides or not.
Right.
And so now we have something extra, presumably in the cases where you decide to raise your arm, now the dividing is going to go up beyond 50%, say to 80%, 90%, maybe 100%. Okay.
Oh, no, that's not the view. It doesn't change the probabilities. It just determines which one happens.
But,
so in a non-random way. So it appears random because really what I would interpret quantum mechanics.
But let's go slowly. When I say the probabilities here, I mean all things considered probabilities. I mean the single case chance. That's what the quantum mechanics says, that the single case chance of the molecule dividing is 50%, and then it's just up to randomness whether it divides or not.
Yeah, well, that's an assumption, because you could equally formulate the view by saying that there's no physical process which predicts which of the two outcomes is going to occur, which leaves it open that there's a non-physical process which influences which of the two outcomes occurs.
Okay, that's fine, but I do think that contradicts quantum mechanics. But I mean, I'm not saying it's not a consistent story. I'm just saying that to the extent that a nervous force field would have contradicted standard non-quantum physics, so the thing you have in mind contradicts standard quantum physics in this way. Quantum physics says, specify all the physical circumstances. Here's this possible outcome. It's going to happen 50% of the time. And nothing else makes any difference to whether or not it happens. That's part of what quantum mechanics is saying, because it's saying those are single case chances. It's a single case chance with respect to this molecule that it's going to divide. You're saying, no, fix all those physical circumstances and add the action of my will. And now the single case chance goes from 50% to 1. And your
That's called collapsing the wave function when it goes to
no. Collapsing the wave function is a matter, that's not collapsing the wave function. Collapsing the wave function is a matter of it's going from being indeterminate whether it's going to divide or not, to it's becoming determinate that it's divided. Either it's divided or it hasn't. So it's that transition from the wave function is not collapsed to it's collapsed, i.e. from its being a 50% single case chance to actuality.
To it being 1.
That's the collapse of the wave function.
Right.
But when you collapse the wave function, you leave it open by the nature of the case, whether it's going to go to split or not split, whether the event's going to go from 0 to 0 or to 1. And so that's supposed to be left open by the collapse. You collapse the wave function. For now, what's happened is it's gone from an indeterminate situation to a determinate situation, either 1 or 0. But in collapsing the wave function, you do not determine which way it goes.
That's right.
And you have in mind that the will is going to determine which way it goes. So the will is doing something more than collapsing the wave function. It's also deciding the outcome.
Right. Yeah, but it's not a physical process which is doing that. So it doesn't contradict the mathematics of quantum mechanics in any way.
No, it doesn't contradict the any more than a nervous force field would contradict the mathematics of Newtonian physics. So,
right.
So
but it doesn't contradict what we observe either on the base of the predictions of the math.
No, it would. It would. Well, it would contradict what quantum mechanics predicts, because quantum mechanics, plus the assumption that there's no analog of nervous force field predicts that we'll get 50% splitting and 50% not splitting, given those physical circumstances,
Right.
whatever else might be happening. But you say, no, given those physical circumstances, plus the action of my will, we won't get 50%, we'll get 1. So that's contradicting quantum mechanics at that point.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I guess I still would disagree, but I guess we should talk about some. I mean, it's a good point, but I don't think it does.
All right, that's fine. It's fine. We don't have to.
Because the will may anyway have different preferences. But anyway, so I'm not a dualist, so thankfully I don't have to worry about those. And as far as I understand, like the view of David Chalmers, who's defended this a little bit, his view is the one that you're saying, which is that the interaction with consciousness collapses it in a random way. So that is the standard way of formulating.
So he's not very.
You don't get free will.
He likes to explore where the quantum mechanics leaves room for the mind to make a difference, but I don't think he thinks, just for this reason, that collapsing still leaves it random. Right. But it's a very good model for our making decisions and our being in control of our actions and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, that is what he thinks. I think that's right. Okay, so we all got started on this because I was asking whether you still accept the case from causal closure to endorsing physicalism. And you started saying, well, you had some reservations. I don't know if we ever got to those reservations.
We haven't yet.
Okay.
But they're kind of techie in the philosophy of causation. So I'm quite moved now by difference-making accounts of causation, probabilistic approaches to causation. Causation being a high-level phenomenon, not something there in basic physics.
Right.
So there's always a question when you identify causes. What kind of grain are you identifying them at? So, I mean, here's a classic case. Here's a flask. It's got water in, some gas. It gets to 100 degrees centigrade. The flask explodes. Why did the flask explode? Well, you can say, well, because all the molecules inside were moving around in these precise ways, and they found a flaw in the glass and it exploded. Or you might say, if all you're interested in is the glass exploding, I mean, it's a glass bottle, let's suppose, it got to 100 degrees centigrade. That's what caused it to explode. So you've got the very generic property of getting to 100 degrees centigrade. You've got the very specific property of the molecules moving in very specific ways. And which do you want to attribute the effect to? And I think the natural thing is to attribute to the temperature and not the highly detailed movement. So this is in line with Stephen Yablow's idea that causes should be proportional. And once you get away from the idea that causation is there at the level of the most fundamental physics and think of causation as a somewhat higher level phenomenon, then there's a question about where, as I said, do you identify the causes. And you might want to identify the causes in generic terms as the temperature reaching a certain level, as opposed to specific molecular movements that realize that generic temperature in a specific case. And similarly, you might want to, in the mind, think that what's causing my behavior is a generic property that corresponds to my wanting to hail a cab, as opposed to the very specific neural arrangements that realize that in me.
Right.
And so now you think, well, so the cause is this generic mental phenomenon rather than the very specific neural arrangements. And once you think that, you might end up thinking, well, there's an effect, my arm moving, that has a mental cause and not a physical cause. And so it looks like a physicalist like me arguing for physicalism from the causal closure of the physical might have kind of cut off the branch that I'm sitting on, because now thinking about causation and physics and so on, I convinced myself that it's not true that every physical effect has a fine-grained physical cause. Some of them are properly attributed to coarse-grained mental causes. And that's a kind of worry about the way that the argument for physicalism is standardly posed in terms of causal closure. Mm-hmm. But I think that's just a kind of rather techie complication, because you could put the argument for for physicalism about the mind in terms that didn't really use the notion of cause, as opposed to when I'd said earlier, look, I've got this kind of worry about causal closure and proportional causes, and then I phrased the argument, and I didn't put it in terms of causation at all. I put it in terms of the way the physical realm unfolds is determined by a bunch of basic forces. I didn't talk in terms of causes at all. And I think you can put the argument for physicalism about the mind in terms of if everything is determined at the physical level, it doesn't leave any room for an independent mind to make a difference. And that argument will go through just the same.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was going to ask you earlier about, generally I think that physicists have moved away from talking about causation at the fundamental level anyway. I mean, you hear physicists say things like, well, we're just describing patterns and we capture the patterns mathematically, but we don't care about the causes down there. Even in quantum mechanics, right? I
think that's right. I think if you get to the level of fundamental physics, I mean, the way it's normally put, everything is time reversible. If you run the movie backwards, it's still in perfectly good accord with the laws of basic physics. If you run the movie backwards, it's not in accord with the everyday phenomenon of cause and effect. If you see somebody smoking in a swimming pool, you run the movie backwards, the causes are somehow going in the wrong direction. So the physics is all fine, but the causes get turned around. So causation is somehow emerges and it floats above the basic physical processes are symmetrical in time. The causes aren't. They must involve something more than the basic physical processes.
Yeah. So can I also ask, why you were talking about your little techie problem in philosophy of science, is that related to the causal drainage problem that Jagan Kim?
Absolutely. So let's put it like this. So Kim says if you have a multiply realized functional type property and a physical one, then you ought to regard this as the cause that excludes that as the cause. You can't have two things being the cause of some results. So you've got to be a reductive physicalist. There's no good being a non-reductive physicalist because this thing will be excluded by that.
Right.
I think it's Ned Block who first, it's his causal drainage problem. He said, hang on, it's worse than you think, Yagwan, because here you've got a reduced property, like, say, mean kinetic energy, reduced temperature. So you want a type reduction to something physical. But Ned said you can't stop there because there's the temperature and then there's specific molecular movements.
Right.
And by your same argument, this is going to exclude that. So the temperature is not causing anything, and nothing is causing anything until you get down to the most fine-grained level of physical description. So that's a causal drainage problem. It's so a reductive physicalist in the mind is still going to be in danger of having their type-reduced mental properties being excluded by more fine-grained realizations of those type mental properties.
Yeah, so you don't think it has anything to do with the multiple realizability point?
It works like this. If you can block Kim's argument, then you will possibly save causation for not just the generic properties like mean kinetic energy, but for multiply realized properties. So blocking Kim's argument gets in both the generic properties and the even more kind of hypergeneric multiply realized properties. But if Kim's argument's any good, it will push you down, not just from the multiply realized generic properties to the type identical physical properties like mean kinetic energy, but all the way down to the most finest grained realizers of those.
Right.
As it happens, I never liked the idea that seriously multiply realized properties can be causal. I've never liked that idea. It's Well, I don't think they can fit into laws. I mean, I've been writing about this for more than 30 years now. Fodor's very radical spatial sciences picture makes no real sense in terms of laws and causation. I've always felt that. So I always thought it should be like temperature and mean kinetic energy. But I never really wanted to go all the way down to the most fine-grained realizers. That seems to me like a kind of uninformed physics worship. Though I think a lot of people have that intuition that the real causes are at the basic physical level, but I think that's just a mistake. When it comes to causation, I think the real determination is going on at the basic physical level, but causation is a rather more high level, we're abstracting away from all the details to get causation.
Right. Yeah. I think we're so many of us are sort of Humean in this respect that we're taking causation at that level to mean something else, like constant conjunction or something a lot weaker than necessitating or determining the effect. But
this is so weak is good there, but constant conjunction is still, it hasn't got the asymmetry in. It doesn't. Right. Constant junctions kind of point both ways, and you want something that's got a real arrow in to get causation. I think it's very akin to thermodynamics. It's akin to the way entropy always increases, and that's got an arrow, but that arrow is not in basic physics. So you have to add something to basic physics to get the arrow of thermodynamics, and similarly, I think you have to add something to basic physics to get the arrow of causation. I suspect they're very similar, but nobody can really unite the two phenomena.
It's tough. I've always hoped that something like decoherence from quantum mechanics would help, but I talked to Sean Carroll about this once, and he said it won't help. So I guess I trust him more than me on this.
Don't bring that in. Decoherence is really part of the problem here, not part of the solution.
Yeah, one hopes otherwise, but say more by what you mean by that.
Well, decoherence is itself a thermodynamic problem. Decoherence happens in a certain direction in time. We're always decohering out like that. It's splitting into the future. And basic physics is temporally symmetric. So you've got to add something to basic physics to get the asymmetry of decoherence. So the asymmetry of decoherence is another asymmetry akin to the asymmetry of thermodynamics and the asymmetry of causation. And if you think about it, it's not surprising. Decoherence is a somewhat coarse-grained phenomenon at the level of the full description of the wave function. There's no decoherence. You have to do some coarse graining to get the decoherence.
Right. Yeah. You had that some interaction with the environment too. So I wonder. So I mean, now I'm sort of a bit confused about the status of this causal closure argument. So what reason do we have to identify the mental with something physical? And specifically, let's take a conscious experience of pain or something like that, or a conscious desire for drinking some water. So I'm moving my arm, I'm grabbing some water.
Yeah.
For dramatic effect, I drink it. So I had something like a conscious thought, a desire, etc. You want to say that was the cause of my arm moving, right?
I do. I want to say.
But I want to say that that's identical with a neural state. And so I'm happy to say the neural state was the cause.
Yeah.
And in fact, the neural state is identical to certain distributions of ions and electrical discharges. So I'm happy to say that was the cause. So which physical thing on your account caused my behavior? I mean, on this, it's the mental thing that did it, the coarse-grained property. I'm just confused, like where are the identifications going on here?
No, look. Can we discuss this on the assumption we're physicalists? So
yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Because sorry, I thought you were worrying about what had happened to the argument for physicalism. But let's suppose you've got an argument for physicalism, not necessarily put in terms of causation, but in terms of the world. Basically, the world would be absurdly complex and Rube Goldbergish. In England, in English, we say Heath Robinsonish. Rube Goldbergish. If there were mental processes alongside the physical processes kind of marching in step. So we'll assume that we've got physicalism. Now your thought is, look, I wanted to say it's got a mental cause and not a physical cause. No, I don't want to say that. I was only saying that in the context of how we're going to pose the argument for physicalism, where you started off the argument for physicalism on the assumption that every physical effect has a physical cause. And now this proportionality stuff seems to stop you saying that at the beginning of the causal closure argument. So now we have to redo the whole causal closure argument. We've redone it, we end up as physicalists, okay? So if I have a conscious desire, that's going to be identical with something physical. Now the question is, I was saying, but it's generic and the physical property is very specific. No, I think it's identical with the generic physical property. So it's identical with the property, let's suppose, of having some neurons arranged in some rather generically specified way. And now in any particular person, you know, their neurons will be a certain size, they'll be kind of placed in a certain place in their brain, they'll be kind of touching each other in very specific ways, but there might be a zillion different ways like that, which all realize the neural requirements for having a desire to drink some water. And what's doing the causing is a generic property of having some neural arrangements of a certain shape. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So it's just like, look, having a certain mean kinetic energy for the molecules, that's a very generic property that's realized by lots of specific molecular movements.
Right.
But it's what all the molecular movements have in common that causes the vase to break, not just, I mean, causes the seal container to break, not the very specific ones. The very specific ones might cause it to break in that particular way at that floor and so on, but the generic result of the container breaking at all, or my arm going up at all, that's explained by the generic property.
I see. Are you going to say the same thing about perceptual experience? Because there I took your argument that they're sort of, well, I guess maybe I'm getting confused or hung up by the word intrinsic that you use a lot, because I know you kind of snuck in at the end that intrinsic properties can be like functional properties. So maybe you're going to, let me just ask, are you going to take the same line about like seeing a blue shirt, like I'm looking at your shirt right now, that's going to be identical with a generic property, or is it a specific neural property that's going to get identified there?
Generic, I'd say. Yes. So you're taking up on stuff I've been writing about recently. I've got a book in draft now, which is about the nature of conscious sensory experience. What's going on when we have sensory experiences? When I can see you on the screen, I'm hearing certain things, I can see the sea out my window and so on. What's going on? Now, focus on my conscious properties that I have when they go away and I close my eyes. Those conscious properties. What are they? What are they? How are they constituted metaphysically? The book's called The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. As it happens, so my targets here are direct realism, who say the conscious property is a matter of a relation, an external relation to the fact being observed outside my head. That's one view. That's disjunctivism. Direct realism probably explains what's going on when I'm having a hallucination or illusion. That's one view. Another view is representationalism, which says the property I'm having is constitutively a property of representing things to be thus and so. And I'll argue against both those views, that no, both those views, if you look at them closely, they might look intuitive. The other view is a bit like the old sense datum view that I want to distinguish myself from. But basically, yeah, it's feelings going on inside my head. That's what it really is. And it doesn't involve facts outside, nor does it even involve the representational relations. It doesn't involve relations to truth conditions. It's just something going on inside me. And that's what I argue in the book. Now, as it happens, I'm a physicalist, so I think the things going on inside me can be identified with various physical things going on inside me. Now you ask me, well, it's going to be pretty generic things if it's just a matter of my seeing something blue, right? There's lots of neural arrangements. Specific neural arrangements could realize that generic property. It's a generic neural feature that I want to identify with the conscious property. But why I paused is because the physicalism doesn't really feature in the book very much at all. My arguments against the direct realists and the representationalists would be just the same if I was a Cartesian dualist. I'd still want to say the conscious properties are intrinsic properties, properties depend on me and not on anything outside me. And to that extent, the representationalists and the direct realists are wrong. So yes,
I mean, some of your arguments would be weakened a little bit if you were Cartesian dualist, because it's a little easier to understand how a non-physical mind can have a relation to an abstract proposition than it is for like a physical brain to do so.
Oh yeah? Why so?
Well, they're both.
I mean, look, I can remember long ago, I think I said, sure, if you've got these weird, mysterious, non-physical goings on, and then it's kind of cheap to add a few more mysteries while you're about it.
Why not?
Given the power to represent things beyond the head. But no, I think that really is an extra different mystery. And if you swallow the mystery of there's a nervous force field inside the head and that affects your behavior and constitutes your consciousness, okay, I'll give you all that. And now tell me how that thing has the power to lay down conditions for the rest of the world to observe in order to be true, purely in terms of its intrinsic nature. Look, I mean, I say this so loudly and confidently because, I mean, I realize having written the book that what I'm doing is drawing out the consequences of the right account of representation as I see it. I've got a fairly naturalist opposed to representation. I think representation is essentially a matter of a relation between a vehicle and external circumstances, which are to do with the vehicle being used by the agent to stand proxy for those external circumstances vis-a-vis the agent's behavior. So I've got all that in place. And when I've got that in place, I start thinking, hang on, it makes no sense that how it is for me consciously should depend not on the nature of the internal vehicle, but on what external circumstances the internal vehicle has been recruited to stand proxy for. Why should that make a difference to how it feels, right? So that's my thinking. Now, I guess there are other people who think of representation in some way as being kind of extruded out from the nature of your internal consciousness. That's a very natural way of thinking about representation. What I do a lot in the book is saying, come on, tell me how that works. It just doesn't seem to me to be a good story about how the feelings inside your head could reach out and lay conditions on the world. I mean, the standard thought experiment we use here is, look, you could have a cosmic brain in a vat, a cosmic swamp brain. Something that coagulates in outer space by chance for 20 minutes, just like your brain, all the same inputs and outputs, keep it going for 20 minutes. I take it, many people would, that it would have the same conscious feelings as you, but those conscious feelings wouldn't really be representing anything. They'd just be feelings of a certain shape. That's the challenge to the
yeah. So
once you've got non-physical conscious feelings, representation comes for free.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I want to ask. I guess the reason why I was thinking what I thought was because of this dependency on the vehicle stuff, which I'm pretty sympathetic to. I mean, I guess I'd say my primary commitment is I like the identity theory. So I like, mind-brain identity. Good. And that's probably my deepest commitment in philosophy, although I wouldn't say I believe it. I certainly think that that's the thing I want to be true the most. So I'm suspicious of my leaning towards the arguments there because I already want it to be true. Anyway, that's the thing I'm committed to the most. So I like these kinds of views like yours, the mental paint by Ned and then this kind of vehicle thing that you've been talking about recently. So I like those kinds of views, but I'm not against representationalism either. So in fact, I've defended a version of it, a higher order version here and there. So I'm, you know, my credences are distributed. So I'm not coming at this with an axe to grind. I'm not trying to save representationalism, but I am curious because you say in the, I haven't read the book, but in the paper on this, you say, you know, here's a sentence, the dog is blue or shirt is blue, although there's a typo there and it says the short is blue, but whatever. So the shirt is blue. And you say, well, it was written in black ink and Times New Roman, and it could have been written in all these different fonts and different colors and express the same representational content, which is obviously true. However, that sentence, the vehicle that realizes it is pretty specific and not generic. The arrangement of the ink, the wavelength reflective properties that it has, those are fairly specific properties. So I'm wondering, where else do we find generic vehicles? Because the ones I think about seem to be fairly specific ones, unless I'm misunderstanding this generic specific thing, which is possible.
So it's a nice analogy, it seems to me. So we have the specific sentence, the one you're looking at, certain font, right? But there seems to be a perfectly good sense in which it would be the same sentence typographically, we're considering it shorn of its meaning, if it was written a different font, a different color. In fact, I mean, it's a real challenge for computer scientists. Hofstadter is wonderfully interesting about this, to locate, to identify the generic physical property that's required for a sentence to be the sentence in English, the shape, this shirt is blue, i.e. the letter T followed by letter H followed by letter I followed by letter S. But there is a very generic property where, I mean, it's pretty response-dependent property. It's to do with our abilities to read, but there's a very generic property that's necessary and sufficient for being an English sentence of that shape. Have you read Hofstadter? I mean, I so love Hofstadter on this stuff. Do you know about Hofstadter's ambigrams?
No, huh? I don't know as much about Hofstadter as I should. I've only read.
You should go after this. Is such a treat. Go and get Metamagical Themas. It's his collection of essays from the Scientific American. He did it 10, 20 years ago. He did the column. It used to be Martin Gardner, Mathematical Games, and he took it over for 2 years, and he wrote about 20 wonderful essays, and the whole book is a delight. And it starts, Metamagical Themas is an anagram of mathematical games. Okay. You turn over, you're on the title page, and he has written Metamagical Themas by Douglas Hofstadter as an ambigram. An ambigram is a palindrome typographical. So it's symmetric around the middle. And he can write by Douglas Hofstadter in a way that is physically symmetric around this line. And we can read it fine. It just looks like by Douglas Hofstadter. And you look at it, you think, how can he make that the same shapes on both sides? And it's just to do with typography. I mean, the range of shapes that you can recognize as a letter A and a letter G are quite enormous. I mean, they're not unlimited, right, obviously, and you can find one that represents letter A and one represents letter G that's a mirror image, and it's such fun. I mean, A and G you can see be quite easy actually. Anyway, I'm rambling.
That's okay.
The point is that yes, there is a very generic physical property, which is a matter of being that vehicle, and I think that's a nice analogy to the intrinsic property that's going to be that vehicle in the brain.
So I mean, I guess I'm thinking, do you know Bob?
I'm just trying to think, what is this intrinsic property going to do? I think it's going to do two things. It's going to constitute a certain type of conscious experience. And it's also going to generate a certain kind of internal behavior. I mean, that's its role qua vehicle, that vehicle of representation. And that seems fine. A generic property can do both those things.
Yeah, I guess I just have a different intuition about the sentence. I'm not sure how to make,
okay,
how to argue for it though. But do you know the work of Bob Fiango by any chance? He's at the grad center. He's retired now, but he was in the linguistics department.
No.
He's written a bunch of stuff on like how different fonts and how when we call the same word, when is it the same word again? It's actually really hard linguistically, like to do that if you get serious about the details. So I guess I just think it's, yeah, there's a generic property. I guess I see that. But when I look at that sentence, I think that sentence couldn't have been otherwise. It had to have been written that way. A sentence like it with the same content could be written differently, but not the same sentence.
It's interesting to me. I hadn't thought about this at all, but I'm perfectly happy with the idea that what it takes for me to have an experience of a shirt being blue is that I have a certain generic neural property, i.e., if we're thinking about things like sentences in the brain, all that's required is that I got a sentence, which is one of the very specific formations that in English typography will be the sentence, "This shirt is blue." And so you can vary the font, you can vary the let's not vary the color, that will be too confusing. We'll vary the font, we'll vary the size, we'll vary the font size, we'll vary the font type, and it will still be the same conscious experience. I'm very happy with that.
Are you really? Because now I'm even more confused, because I thought it was the intrinsic nature of the vehicles which determine the kind of experience. So if you change those properties of the vehicles, it seems like you should change the nature of the kind of experience.
I don't see why a generic property shouldn't be an intrinsic one. Intrinsic just means it's being possessed by me, doesn't depend on how things are with any other beings, and that the generic property can be intrinsic in that sense.
It doesn't depend on, so it's just a denial of the externalism or something like that.
That's all intrinsic means there. So
yeah,
it doesn't mean a most specific physical characterization.
It doesn't mean non-relational in the real sense of that word, because there's tons of relations internally within the brain which might matter.
Sure. Yeah. Good.
So then so as long as, so the idea that the vehicles are what determine the conscious experience is really flexible on your way of thinking about it, because what counts as the same vehicle, you're going to be pretty open about. Yeah.
So the book is pretty non-committal on these issues, because the aim is just to argue for a pretty open-ended position against the alternatives, the direct realist position, and what's my real target is a representationalist view, which is kind of the dominant view, and that everybody pays lip service to it. We're all representationalists about experience, and I used to pay lip service to myself. I mean, at the beginning of the book, I say, look, I used to think I was a representationalist. When Chalmers and Bourget did their survey, must be getting on for 10 years ago, and what do you think about sensory experience? Are you a direct realist, a sense-laden theorist? I ticked representationalist, and only when I was thinking about in detail, because I was thinking about phenomenal concepts, I wasn't especially thinking about representation. I wrote a paper, Perceptual and Phenomenal Concepts, trying to think, what did I think about phenomenal concepts? I realized I had commitments about what was making perceptual states conscious, how their consciousness varied with various changes. That was just antithetical to what representationalists think. And I started thinking about what it was to be a representationalist about sensory experience. And I realized that it involved lots of weird, and to my mind, implausible commitments. Look, for instance, if you're a representationalist about sensory experience, what do you say about the fact that I have a certain experience because when my wife comes through the door, as indeed she just did?
I heard it.
and
I heard wifely.
And now suppose that my Australian doppelganger with a identical looking wife, his wife comes through the door, and now I take it he's going to have just the same type of sensory experience, let's suppose for the sake of the argument. But if you're representationalist, then that must mean that those two experiences have just the same contents, representational contents. And now, and this is standard for representationalists, you better not have the representational experiences representing the particular wives, because those would be different representational contents. And if you're a committed representationalist, you have to have different experiences because they're different particular wives, but nobody wants that. So they end up saying, therefore, the sensory experience can't represent particular people. And I think, well, it looks like the theoretical tail's wagging the dog here. Surely my sensory experience represents my wife. I mean, I've got a whole bit of my brain that's devoted to learning what faces look like so I can recognize my wife again and producing a conscious experience that goes with her. I don't want some philosophical theory telling me that eccentric experience doesn't represent my wife. So that's how I started, yeah. So
I mean, yeah, there's
you think something like that, and then you end up writing a whole book.
Yeah, that's the beauty of philosophy. But I want to go back a couple of steps. I want to talk about that specific point, but I want to still get this vehicle thing because I'm still. So, I mean, the part of the thing I'm not being very articulate right now, and the argument from sputtering is not a very good argument, obviously. So I'm trying to formulate what I'm trying to say, but it seems like the way you're doing the things right now is tying the vehicle, the identity of the vehicle, too much to the representational content that the vehicle happens to be carrying. Whereas I thought your view was that these were independent. But now it's sort of, you're saying, I hear you saying that, well, say what kind of vehicle it is. It can be lots of different things as long as it's got that content, it's the same vehicle.
No. My view is that conscious experience goes with, let's think we're physicalists, the physical, generic physical nature of the vehicle. The representationalists have a completely different view. They think the conscious experience goes not with the vehicle, but what with the vehicle happens to represent. I mean, when you think it through, it's a pretty crazy view. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I don't want to be rude in philosophy, but it's not a happy view. So, especially for the naturalist representationists. But look, here's something going on inside my brain, and the representationalist thinks that what makes it feel the way it does is what it represents outside my brain.
Right.
So, if I had a different vehicle representing that same thing, it would feel different. Sorry, hang on. If I had a different vehicle representing the same thing, it would feel the same. And now I'm jumping ahead. And if I had the same vehicle representing something different, it would feel different. And I mean, that's the basic commitment of representationalism. And that's just really weird, that how it feels is not to do with what's going on inside my head, but what outside my head, the thing inside my head has been recruited to represent. That's what full-on representationalism thinks. Look, it's very different from what I call in the book weak representationalism, which is just the view that sensory experiences do represent, not that their conscious nature is fixed by how they represent, but just that they do represent.
Right.
And of course, it's certainly true that sensory experiences represent.
But my question
they don't represent essentially in virtue of their conscious properties. So I draw the analogy with sentences. Look, here's a sentence: that shirt is blue. It represents all right, but it doesn't represent in virtue of its property as a sentence. Just that sentence could have meant nothing at all, or something different, or does mean something different in different languages. It represents not because of its shape as a sentence, but because of how it's used by English people. And I think the same about conscious sensory brain states.
But what makes two vehicles the same in the brain?
Good question. And I mean, that's kind of onto the question which I thought you were going to press me about. Look, I've got an eye on the clock because I have a couple of appointments now backing up.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't even looking at the clock. We can end whenever you're ready. We can.
Yeah. Well, look, we should wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Okay.
So, can you wrap up? But I was saying that I thought when I came on, you were going to press me about theories of consciousness. Was I a higher order theorist, integrated information theorist, global workspace theorist, and so on? And we haven't talked about that, and I'm quite glad because I'm not sure I'm that.
Well, I have to have you back because I was going to ask. I thought we had another few minutes, more than 5. But anyway, so I should have discussed that with you beforehand. But these things tend to go on for like about 2 hours or so.
I didn't know. Look,
no, that's not my fault. But it's no big deal. So I'll wrap this up here.
I was assuming we'd do an hour.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's my fault for not clearing that beforehand. Yeah.
Well, do you want to? Can we carry on some other time?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I do want to ask you about those things. And really, we haven't even got to the things we have been talking about, I think, are fairly fundamental and important, but we haven't even got to the stuff that, you were expecting me to talk about.
You have a choice here. And I could email my student now and say, can I put it off for half an hour? And then we could not wrap up in a hurry. Would you? I was just going to.
I feel bad for the student, but I mean, yeah, if you're open to that,
I think that's fine. It's a student in my class. We're going to chat about his term paper. I set aside half an hour. I think I can email him and say, can we just postpone it for half an hour?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
I think that's okay. Just look, I'm just doing an email now quickly.
Well, thanks, David. I feel bad for having you do this, but I'll still let you do it.
No, I'm assuming. Look, where everybody is self-isolating now. Can you give me another 30 minutes? I'm in a video cast. I didn't know went on so long.
Sorry about that.
No, it's not your fault. Sorry.
Blame Richard Brown. I'll take the blame for that.
There, so that's one, and now I've got another one. The student after that. I'll do him too. There, done them both.
Well, let's hope they say yes.
No, if they say no, then I'm out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Then we'll cut it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry about interruption. Okay, so now we've got half an hour. That's fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel we should have mentioned that before we started when we were chatting about.
No, I didn't imagine that you would impose 2 hours on your viewers.
It's the longest one has been 2.5 hours, but we won't go there. But anyway, and often they are 1.5 hours, so it's not like it's unheard of. But anyway, I did want to ask your views about consciousness. I really enjoy your interactions on Twitter. You know, I know Philip pretty well, and you guys argue a lot. So why aren't you a panpsychist is one question I wanted to ask. And the second, and the reason I sort of saw some exchanges between you that suggested that you were more sympathetic to panpsychism than I might have thought. And I wonder if that's because of the causal sorts of things that we've been talking about, because I do think panpsychism has a leg up on a lot of other non-physicalist views in that area.
So yeah, no, panpsychism, look, curiously, all the theories of consciousness that we know, we're not talking about the metaphysical theories of consciousness, we're not in the business of kind of empirical global workspace theories of consciousness, just the metaphysical theories of consciousness, consciousness separate from the physical realm and so on. They all respect the causal closure of the physical. So when Chalmers and Jackson first convinced themselves that the conscious mind couldn't be physical, they felt compelled to be epiphenomenalists. I mean, they weren't interactive dualists. They said, look, clearly the physical realm is closed, doesn't admit any independent influences. If the mind is independent, it's just going to have to dangle. I mean, they were prepared to bite that bullet because once they'd convinced themselves the mind was non-physical, they were forced to it by the causal closure.
I don't think that's fair for Chalmers, by the way. He has type D dualism, that stands for Descartes. He was open to epiphenomenalism, but even in his first book, he was like, you know, I could be an interaction dualist, and I don't see a problem with that.
Is that right? I mean, I read the first book, and I think I reviewed it. I mean, I did review it, and
yeah, you did.
No, it's not one of those cases. I mean, you know the classic philosophical joke. I mean, have you read that book? Read it? I haven't even reviewed it.
Yeah, exactly.
But I did read it and then reviewed it. But I formed the impression that on reading it that the epiphenomenalism was his preferred option in the conscious mind. And we could go back and have a look. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. He's moved, as I see it, from favoring epiphenomenalism to favoring Russellian monism. And the interesting thing about that oscillation is both of them respect the causal closure of the physical. And Jackson has moved from epiphenomenalism to physicalism.
Yeah,
because he thinks epiphenomenalism is so horrible, but he doesn't move to Cartesian interactive dualism. He moves to physicalism. So everybody's kind of avoiding.
sorry.
Somebody coming to the door. So where were we? How did we get into?
Well, because I was asking about
panpsychism. So let's suppose we're in the realm of theories that respect the causal closure. Yeah, sure. If I was somebody who thought that somehow conscious reality was metaphysically extra to the reality described by physics, which is what the standard anti-physicalist arguments push you to, knowledge argument plus conceivability argument, so on, then I would be a panpsychist, I guess. I mean, it's the way of having the conscious mind separate from the physical in a way that is very much in accord with the idea that there's no causal processes that are different from the causal processes described by physics. But in fact, that's not why I'm inclined towards psychology. It's panpsychism. It's not the thought that if I were an anti-physicalist, then I ought to be a panpsychist that makes me sympathetic to panpsychism. It's more the thought that, and here's a different thing. So I've always felt that the reason people think there's an explanatory gap, hard problem, and so on, is nothing to do with technical philosophical arguments. It's to do with the fact that we all, for reasons probably to do with the architecture of our minds, find physicalism almost impossible to believe. We're all intuitive dualists.
It's a psychological phenomenon.
I mean, yeah, our resistance to physicalism has a psychological basis. It's like, everybody thinks that time moves, right? And you do philosophical analysis, it turns out that force doesn't even make any sense, really. But somehow it's a way we're inclined to think, and I think we're inclined to think about the mental and the physical in the same way. We inclined to think of them as clearly they're different, when in fact, when we start doing analysis, we realize they're not. I think that many people doing the science of consciousness, doing the philosophy of consciousness, don't realize how far they're in the grip of this mistaken dualist intuition. And when it comes to the science of consciousness, I think this makes people think, look, we need a chunky, serious theory to kind of draw the line around those brain processes that give us this extra thing, that turn on the light. There's this extra kind of magic dust around in certain areas of reality. And I don't think that's a good way to think about consciousness and the science of consciousness.
I mean, I think that's a little bit unfair, the way you're characterizing
panpsychism. But I'm just explaining to you why I feel attracted to panpsychism. So I've been kind of encouraged by recent stuff by Peter Godfrey Smith and Eva Jablonka and her associates about thinking about the evolution of organisms and their developing sense of self, and evolution of kind of central nervous systems, and at what point do we kind of start getting consciousness. And I've started to think, look, the important thing is not, look, there's certain physical processes that have a special glow. Rather, it's that at some point you have subjects, you have centers of cognition for whom certain physical states are present. Those physical states are like something for those beings, but the new thing is the beings, not the physicals. There's nothing special about physical. Any physical states could play that role if they were recruited by biological subjects to feature in their deliberations and action control and so on. So that's the thought. So, any physical states have got the wherewithal to be conscious if there's only something for which they're conscious. So that's the extent of my panpsychism. There's nothing special about the conscious physical states. It's just that they're playing a certain role. And
right, but it's not real panpsychism in a sense that they aren't experiential when they're not playing that role, in your view, are they?
No, but the real panpsychist, they're only proto-experiential. I mean, they're, I don't know, there's no...
I mean, that just sounds like physicalism.
My view is not really like panpsychism. I mean, I at one point in writing something said that, there's some affinity or some shared claims with panpsychism.
Right.
Here, and Philip got terribly excited by that.
He did. I saw that. But I mean, that's just physicalism, right? Just saying there's nothing special about the mental. It's just more physical stuff arranged in the right way. So any of the physical stuff could. I mean, that doesn't sound especially panpsychic to me. It just sounds like.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think a hard-headed physicalism really has to resist the idea that there's some special glow. I mean, the intuitive idea. Clearly is I mean, it's antithetical to physicalism, but I do worry that the intuitive idea is driving a lot of work in people looking for the neural correlates of consciousness.
I see what you're saying.
And so on.
Yeah, like, there's got to be some special neurochemical property that's going to give rise to consciousness. I think Ned thinks that way sometimes. It's something about the fact that it's changed from electrical activity to chemical activity that's significant for conscious experience. It could only be that, maybe.
So there's something, the way I'm thinking about it should push you towards asking, which is consciousness an important natural kind? What explanatory task is performed by appeals to consciousness? What happens when things are conscious that wouldn't happen otherwise? And I think if you start asking that question, you might get uneasy about Ned Block's idea. Well, look, there's access consciousness, but that's not the real thing. What we're kind of really interested in is phenomenal consciousness. And I'm not sure that once we, notions of access, higher order representation of mental states, that's an important thing. We can explain a lot of things in terms of that. Global availability, that's an important thing. We can explain a lot of things in terms of that. But now there's supposed to be this extra thing. And I want to know, what are we going to explain? I had a bit of an epiphany once. I was talking to neuroscience 20 years ago, and I said, you've got to be interested in consciousness. And they said, no, we're serious neuroscientists. We're physicalists. We're interested in various kinds of cognitive science and flowcharts and so on. But what's this extra thing, consciousness? And I said, look, there's all this interesting data. Look, there's dorsal stream processing, and that's not consciousness. I mean, that's not conscious. Isn't that amazing? You've got to be interested in that kind of thing. And morphine pain, morphine pain is still conscious. You wouldn't have expected that. Isn't that interesting? And they said, yeah, that's interesting, but that's just to do with access, right? You're saying that the Ware pathway isn't accessible. You're saying that the morphine pain is accessible. You don't need an extra notion beyond access to talk about that. And I started to think, you're right. You're absolutely right. What is this extra thing that we can explain in terms of some mental state being phenomenally conscious? And I've never seen a good answer. I mean, there's the big debate, Ned Block's cognitive overflow stuff about the Sterling data at the back of the brain. And there's a huge debate between Ned, who thinks that this kind of stuff that you forget very fast was conscious, and the opponents say, no, it wasn't conscious. And then they try and explain what's going on. But I don't see how the difference between whether it's conscious or whether it's not conscious makes any difference to explaining all the performances. So,
I'm a part of that debate. We're actually thinking of some experiments that might help us arbitrate between those two views at some level. But I want to go back to the panpsychism a bit, because just to be fair, it's not their view that consciousness is something extra to the physical. Their view is that the physical is identical to consciousness. And so, I mean, that's certainly Philip's view. It's the idea that what consciousness is, what the physical stuff is, like electrons or their charges or whatever, is a bit of consciousness.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I was in fact using extra to the physical in a slightly term of art sense there. So the Russellian monists, panpsychists, they do in a sense think that what's conscious is extra physical. It's going to have this very specific notion of what we're told by physics. And what we're told by physics is everything's characterized by description. These electrons, and what are the things that do certain things, and there's protons, and you say there are these things that play certain roles. So all physics gives you is the roles, the kind of the structure of what's going on. And it leaves out, so they say, the realizes things that play those roles, the underlying properties, the quiddities, and that's where the consciousness comes in. And they have in mind you could have another world which has just the same structure as our world, but where different things are playing playing the underlying roles, and those things wouldn't be conscious, and that's a zombie world, they say. That's how zombies are conceived. You're conceiving of a world in which the same roles are played by non-conscious things. So that's the sense in which I think they think of the conscious stuff as extra to the physical. And I guess I'm not attracted by that. I'm not inclined to be a Russellian monist. I don't see the attraction of an idea that in addition to all the behavior described by physical, there's a further fact about which things are playing the roles. So, I mean, they're committed to the view that there's another world just like this world in which bodies have sizes and they resist accelerations and so on, but whereas in our world, that role is played by mass. In this other world, there's a different quantity, smash, that's responsible for the resistance of bodies to accelerations and so on.
Right.
And my reaction is, no, that's not a different possible world. That's just another world with mass in. I mean, how could you have a quantity that, you know, is resistant to acceleration, proportional gravitational attraction, and so on, and it not be mass? Why are you duplicating these quantities to no purpose? So I see no reason to allow the space for these.
Whether you call it mass or not, I guess is a terminological point. It's like water on twin Earth. I was like, yeah, I think there's water there. Some people say no, it's not.
But the question is, would it be a different quantity? I mean, does it make sense to suppose a world might have exactly the same shape in terms of the basic physical patterns, and a different quantity play the role? I mean, that's the standard Humean view. That's what we're brought up with, but it leads to this kind of necessary ignorance. We don't know, apart from the case of direct conscious access, which properties are playing the role in question. And
I mean, yeah, I can. So, but would you agree with the limited claim, the conditional claim that that if you're a panpsychist, then you can explain mental causation in the normal way, because if there's a certain mental act causing a physical act, then there's a brain activity causing the physical act. The brain activity just is consciousness on their view. So consciousness has a causal role.
Yes. I mean, there are lots of tricky issues here. I mean, Sir Richard Howell has argued that panpsychism Robert Howell, exactly, in this orthodox Russellian monist form, that gives rise to epiphenomenalism, because you get the same causation in the actual world with the conscious fillers and the zombie world with non-conscious fillers. And so the difference between the conscious and non-conscious worlds is making no causal difference. But I think panpsychists can reply very, very reasonably that if you're a Humean about causation, which of course they are, being panpsychists, then what it is to be something that causes some result is to be the property that plays a relevant role in the actual world. So I think panpsychists Russellian panpsychists are fine on the causation. I don't have a problem with that. But I think the whole metaphysics is undermotivated in the first place.
Yeah,
I think that one would argue against the metaphysics anyway on the grounds that it leads to this absurd Ramseyan humility. I mean, you don't know what's playing the roles, even if you know what the roles are perfectly well. So, independently of anything to do with consciousness, I'm inclined to be a dispositional essentialist about basic physical properties. I also think it's undermotivated. I don't see what's wrong with equating conscious properties with ordinary non-Russellian quiddity physical properties. I don't buy the conceivability argument, knowledge argument program in the first place. So I've got no problem with regarding the identity of conscious properties and physical properties as just like ordinary ordinary scientific identities. I don't seem to see a need to find some possible world to make good the thought that zombies are possible.
Yeah.
Zombies just aren't possible, it's my view.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they're not even conceivable. So I'm definitely on board with that.
No, I'm not even being conceivable. They're conceivable, they're not possible. Why suppose everything that's conceivable is possible? It's a very strange view. And I mean, Chalmers and Jackson have been arguing this line for a long time, but there's a lot of smoke and mirrors there. And when you really unpack it, it's not very plausible.
Yeah, I tend to have some sympathy with that, but I think that even if you take their view that everything's a priori, what's a priori conceivable is possible. Yeah. I've argued for the existence of things I've called shambies, which are just conscious beings that are merely physical. I think that's conceivable. So if that's conceivable, that's possible. And so I don't think that on a 2D semantic view, you can have both of those be possible. So one of them's got to be inconceivable. Seems to me the only way to choose is where you pre-theoretically already found plausibility. So that's how I would argue for the inconceivability of the zombies. They seem possible, I grant that, but I don't think they actually, they seem conceivable, but I don't think they really are.
I think they seem possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's issues here about exactly what we understand by conceivable. I think they seem possible, but they aren't possible. I think they can seem conceivable, and I think they are conceivable, but yeah.
What do you think about, I mean, sure, do you think the merely physical duplicates that are conscious are conceivable too, right?
Merely physical duplicates that are conscious?
Yeah.
Merely physical duplicates. But hang on. Okay. No, I'm lost here. So I think I can conceive a being who's physically just like me and not conscious. And that's a merely physical duplicate in the sense it's only a physical duplicate, it's not a conscious duplicate. But if you ask me to conceive, I mean, I can conceive a physical duplicate who is conscious, that's easy too. But I don't understand what I'm supposed to conceive if I conceive a merely physical duplicate who is conscious. Merely means
just physical.
Physical duplicate and not a conscious duplicate. So how am I supposed to conceive a merely physical duplicate that is conscious? I didn't get it.
Yeah, no, I meant to mean just purely physical. So just a physical duplicate with nothing else. Because sometimes people want to sneak in some other kinds of stuff in there. But I think, no, you can have just the physical duplicate and also consciousness. That's perfectly conceivable.
Yeah, so I conceive that by conceiving that here's a being that has all my physical properties, and what's more, its conscious properties are identical to its physical properties.
Yeah, exactly.
And just like I conceive something which is H2O, and what's more, water is H2O, so I'm conceiving something that is H2O and thereby water. I mean, surely that's conceivable. But see, I think of what's conceivable as just as what can be, as it were, written down as a sentence without a contradiction in.
Right.
So I think clearly I can conceive Cicero is not Tully, even if they're actually the same person, and even if these are brute million terms. What's to stop me writing down Cicero not equal Tully? Who's going to stop me writing that down? I mean, and that's all it takes to conceive of what's in fact an impossibility. I mean, so I think the people who think that there's some difficulty of conceiving that are way down a hole that involves thinking of the contents of thoughts in terms of sets of possible worlds, and there's no possible world, so I can't conceive something like that. And no, we don't have to think of conceiving in terms of sets of possible worlds and thoughts having contents like that. We just have to think of conceiving as taking the words in the language of thought, Cicero, not equals, and Tully, and putting them next to each other. I'm conceiving something to which no possible world corresponds. But why did we start thinking of conceivings in terms of relations to sets of possible worlds in the first place? Complete mistake.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But it does bring up the question. I know I'm keeping my eye on the time. We've got about a minute and a half before we're going to wrap this up. But it does bring up the question about this intuitive resistance to dualism, because I have no intuitive, to physicalism. I have no intuitive resistance to physicalism. I've never found it hard to conceive the physical being mental and mental being physical. As soon as I thought about mental causation, I was convinced that the mind must be the brain in some sense or some physical property. But so why do so many people find it so hard to conceive of this? I mean, if your view
but so on my view, the intuitive resistance is not to do with finding it hard to conceive, but finding it hard to believe. So as I think about it, I can conceive, as I said, I can conceive a being having all my physical properties, and I can conceive that the conscious properties just are those physical properties. I just conceive the idea that they're equal. But I say it's hard to believe. So I could conceive, I don't know, water being, I could see something being sodium chloride, and I could conceive it's there by being water, by conceiving that water is NaCl, but I don't believe it at all. But let's try this. Here's I've got some papers. I've got a paper called Kripke's Proof That We're All Intuitive Dualists. I've got a slightly non-standard, but I think completely accurate reading of the argument end of naming necessity. Let me try this little test case on you. Suppose I ask you to imagine that Marilyn Monroe is not Norma Jean Baker. Okay, how you getting on? Just imagine.
I'm doing it, but I'm imagining two separate people, one being Marilyn, one being Norma Jean.
Yeah, okay. No, you were supposed to say, hang on, that's a bit hard. What am I supposed to imagine, right? I mean, there's just one person.
It's easy. You imagine that there's two people.
Okay, so now I think, I think when we ask people to imagine a being, a zombie, a being which has all the physical properties and then conscious properties are different, people find that perfectly easy. They understand straight away what you're supposed to imagine. But when you ask somebody to imagine Marilyn Monroe not being Norma Jean Baker, they might say, well, I don't quite understand what I'm supposed to imagine. There's one person. I mean, they believe there's one person. How am I supposed to imagine one person not being themselves? I know you can do a bit of work. I mean, with the appearances, but you're not really imagining Marilyn Monroe not being Norma Jean Baker.
I'm not imagining the same person being a different person, right? Yeah.
I think people don't have the corresponding difficulty with imagining physical properties not being conscious properties and vice versa. So I think that just shows that we didn't ever buy the identity in the first place. If we bought the identity, look, if you were a serious identity theorist, right, and you really think that the pains and the C5s find same thing, right? There's just one thing there, just like Marilyn Monroe's Norma Jean Baker. And then somebody asks you, imagine a zombie who has, and you're thinking, I'm being asked to imagine they've got that property and not that property at the same time.
Right.
What am I supposed to be imagining? I think this is my argument that we are all intuitive dualists. I don't think any of us have that reaction first time round. That what am I supposed to be imagining? There's just one property there.
I think I did have that.
Okay, you're a happy natural born physicist.
I am. But it's like, I think it works better when you do H2O, because nobody in the right mind believes you can conceive of a world where there's H2O and the physical laws like ours and yet no water. No one believes that.
And I can conceive it. Sorry, look, there are plenty of people who didn't used to believe it. Well, hang on. I mean, perhaps by the time we knew about H2O, we knew about water. But
right.
No, there are plenty of people who don't believe it. I mean, suppose you haven't learned your chemistry very well. I mean, you kind of, yeah, okay.
Once you know that, but that's where the importance of the theories come in. I know I got to let you go because I don't want to keep this student waiting any longer than we already have. So
we can't.
please send them my way. But David, I want to thank you for your time. This has been a really enjoyable discussion. I learned a lot from talking with you.
Yeah.
I'm reading your work too, by the way. So I just appreciate your time, willingness to have these kinds of discussions. You're very active in the online area, you know, do a lot of podcasts and Twitter and all that stuff. And I think we need more philosophers like you doing that. So I really appreciate it.
Richard, very nice to talk to you. Thank you for having me on. Take it easy, enjoy your seclusion, get lots of work done, and let's be in touch.
Okay, cool.
That's
so
it.
let me, I'm going to end it. I'll say it by off air, just really second.